My name is Jennifer Kirby, and I am the brand new coordinator for the Montana Abolition Coalition. And I'm here today with Ron Waterman, who is a prominent attorney. I was told you're a prominent attorney. Are you?
Probably.
Probably, okay. And we're here to talk today about the Montana Abolition Coalition and what our hope is for the 2009 legislature. Thank you to Dave Wanzenreed for putting in a bill draft that will hopefully abolish the death penalty in Montana in the 2009 legislature, and that's our goal. So, how many people know what the Montana Abolition Coalition is? Good, not all of you. I'm raising my hand because they hired me, so I had to know what it was. The Montana Abolition Coalition was started in 1998, and it was a coalition of groups designed to educate citizens and policymakers alike about the flaws in the state death penalty system. And in 2007, we made national history when the Montana Senate voted to abolish the death penalty. Though the bill failed by one vote in the House committee, news of the success rippled across the nation. And today, the nation's eyes are on Montana. And that's why we were able to secure funding in order to hire a full-time coordinator, which is me, and to eliminate the death penalty. Hopefully, I'll be out of a job next year. The members of the Montana Coalition include ACLU, which explains why I'm here, the Montana Advocacy Program, the Montana Association of Churches, the Montana Catholic Conference, the Montana Human Rights Network, Equal Justice USA, Murder Victims' Families Groups, Amnesty International, and Journey of Hope, just to name a few. I know I named a lot, though. So, basically what I'm going to do today, I talked about the Montana Abolition Coalition. I'm going to show you a short video. Actually, it's part of a video. If you find the video riveting and fascinating, and you want to take it home and add it to your own collection, I have copies for you. Okay, I can see you guys are all excited, but that's just because you haven't seen the video yet. After you see it, you'll want it. And at the same time, I'm going to pass around this sheet, Montana Abolition Coalition, to sign up to volunteer, because throughout the next year, we're going to be doing a lot of events, and we're going to be lobbying our legislators to abolish the death penalty in the 2009. So, if you sign this, I'm going to give you a free cookie. You just had to get it at the last break. That's the only rule. Other than that, free cookies. So please do sign up. And I will have brochures available, as well as information about how to get a hold of me. I'm so new, I haven't got business cards yet, so I had to make my own. So you get those. But right now, we'll just start the video. And then after I'm done, then Ron will come up here and talk about the lethal injection challenge.
You know, the day she died, she should have died. She wasn't supposed to be there. She switched shifts with another girl so she could play softball that afternoon on a various softball team. And she wasn't even supposed to be there. And it was just a series of events. The killer went to another restaurant first and actually got in. The girl let him in. But when he got inside, there were a couple of guys in there with her. So he just went ahead and pretended to serve as the fountain machine and left. And then he went down the street to where Nancy's restaurant was. You have two choices when this happens to you. You can let it eat you alive and kill you too, or you can fight back and heal. I do this because I choose to honor Nancy's memory this way. I do not choose to honor her memory by killing another person in her name. I could do that. And as long as we're humans and we make mistakes, we need to be in the business killing people. It's wrong.
Searching for freedom. The death penalty is an issue that the more you learn about it, the less you like it. The more reasons you see why we shouldn't be doing it.
To execute one person who is innocent is simply unacceptable.
We, the innocent, are the collateral damage of the death penalty. I mean, plain and simple.
People are capable of rehabilitation.
My closure comes when the death penalty is abolished in this country.
It makes me kind of angry at our justice system because
We want to change it, because we're the generation of the future.
I can see justice without having to see blood. I don't have to see someone hurt. You realize that justice has been served.
I have one picture of me that somebody took the day of the funeral. And I was so pale that it was like somebody just drained all the blood out of me. My eyes were dark, sunken in my head. I couldn't even hardly believe it was me.
About 2 weeks after the crime, Chris Ochoa and Richard Danziger were apparently in the car, either going somewhere or riding around.
The Pizza Hut had reopened. There was a security guard there now. And they went in and ordered some beer and drank a toast to Nancy's memory.
The lead investigator in the case had a meeting with Pizza Hut employees and had stressed to them how important it would be to notice anything unusual that goes on.
So he called the police and told them. And they picked them up the next day.
Police initially got on what turned out to be a rabbit trail, and it turned out that the lead that they had was false. So they had just wasted 10 days. They had been up all night, running on adrenaline and coffee, and all of a sudden they were back to square one. And then they get a tip. And so they jump on that tip.
He didn't care who he got for my daughter's killing. Anybody would have done. It was just Chris and Richard's bad luck to be in the wrong place at the wrong time.
That they were in a psychological state, these officers, such that they were prone to jump to conclusions. And I think that's what happened.
They're telling Chris that whoever confesses first is going to get life and the other's going to get the death penalty. They told Christopher they were going to take him downstairs and put him in a cell where those guys didn't know what to do with fresh young meat like him. They poked him in the arm with a fountain pen to show him where the lethal injection was going to go. They threw chairs at him.
Chris Ochoa was terrified. He was scared to death.
I mean, terrified.
He was bullied. He said what he ultimately believed the police officers wanted to hear.
I shot her in the back of the head right here. I was in the AA program on this unit when I was in population, and I told my substance abuse counselor, Ann Coleman, about murder, because part of the program is taking responsibility, making amends and all that they teach there.
King Marino was in prison, and he wrote the Austin Police Department a letter saying that he's the person who actually committed this crime. King Marino gave so many details of the crime. He knew so much about it.
Here's where the murder weapon is. Here's the keys I took. Here's the bank bag I took the money in. At his parents' house in El Paso, they went out there and sure enough, there that stuff is.
The investigators got a a semen sample from Akeem Marino. They tested it, and it matched.
State District Judge Robert Perkins gave the official and end-all word,
I don't think we're going to
which Tuesday morning ended an 11-year emotional torture for Christopher Ochoa as he walked away from prison for good.
It was easy for prosecutors to just say, oh, that didn't happen. That's just people talking. But I think now that there's no doubt that sometimes the system breaks down. There's no doubt that sometimes an innocent person is convicted.
It's probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I went to see him. I sat across a table from him. I begged him to take a plea bargain to save his life. I believe that life is God-given, and it's only his to take. So when I left the jail, I simply called a press conference and asked the people of Texas to call the district attorney's office in loving memory of my daughter and myself, and asked that the death penalty be taken off the table for this man. And the next week it was. I honored my daughter by saving a life, not taking a life.
You know, he went marching off to Vietnam. They appreciate.
How many people want to see more? I told you guys would want the video. So sometimes what I hear is that this kind of story, the story of an innocent, doesn't happen in Montana. Well, 137 people nationwide have been exonerated from death row. And right here in Montana, and you can read the story on our brochure about Jimmy Ray Bromgard. He spent 14 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. 15 years in prison. Thank you, Ron. 15 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And where did he spend that time? Montana. It does happen. It happens in Montana. It happens across the nation. And it happens when people's lives are at stake. But I think the second thing about that story, I see hands racing out for that brochure. You guys really want it, don't you? Is that we got to see not only that innocence happens, but we also got to see the victim's family's response. And that's an important aspect in our fight against the death penalty. I honored my daughter's memory by saving a life, not taking a life. I didn't sink to that level. And that's why we're in this fight. For the innocent victims. The people that are the innocent men that are put on death row or put in prison. And the innocent people that have to go through the ordeal of watching a life be taken in memory, in honor of their loved one. So that's why we're in the fight. And I do have lots of brochures for people to read, so you don't have to pass it around. I also have a card. As I said, I made my own business cards. Aren't they snazzy? I cut them myself and everything. I will get new ones. And I have the DVDs. So, where's the list at? Right back there? How many people signed up on the list? How many people ate cookies? Okay, I better not see anybody raising their hand eating cookies that hasn't signed up. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. So, here are more DVDs. Please feel free to take one. I want to leave lots of time for discussion and questions at the end, so I am going to hand it over to Ron. And at the end, if there's stuff you want to discuss or questions you want to ask or anything like that, we'll have lots of time to do that.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
I appreciate very much that everybody here. We okay? I'm Ron Waterman. I'm an attorney in Helena, and I'd like to talk to you this afternoon about the death penalty issue. I've testified before the legislature every session but one since 1995 relative to abolishing the death penalty. I think it's important today for you to understand, exactly where we are and what's going to happen as we move forward toward the 2009 legislative session, because that's really probably the focal point of where the abolition is going to be working. You should understand that shortly we will be filing suit. I anticipate that the ACLU and others will be filing suit to challenge lethal injection here in Montana. And although that challenge is going to occur, I think you have to understand that the challenge is not going to be the end of the struggle to end the death penalty in Montana. Rather, it's the first step to underscore that the death penalty, no matter how administered, constitutes cruel and unusual punishment and should be abolished totally in Montana. So while we are going to be challenging the lethal injection in the court system, ultimately abolition needs to be presented to and passed by the legislature. While it's possible that a court system may, at some time in the future, hold that all death penalties are cruel and unusual punishment, that is not the current direction of either the challenge that we will undertake, nor is it a direction of what's happening before the United States Supreme Court. And I'll come back and talk a little bit about that challenge. So what I'm asking you to do is to today learn something about this issue and continue to learn more about this issue. And between now and when the 2009 legislature meets, I'd ask you to speak to those individuals who are seeking to be elected to the House and to the Senate, inform them of why it is important for them to vote for an abolition bill. The last legislature, as everyone said, the abolition movement came very close to achieving passage of the bill in both houses of the legislature. The bill passed the Senate, and it would have passed, I believe, the entire House had it not been bottled up in the House Judiciary Committee. And there it lost by one vote to get out onto the floor. So as a consequence, we were very, very close. And I think that it's important for we here in this room to understand the importance of that fact. New Jersey has just abolished the death penalty. Its legislature did that. Its governor signed the bill. And that's a significant step. Nebraska has essentially abolished the death penalty. Their Supreme Court ruled that electrocution was cruel and unusual punishment. They would have an option, if you will, of going to lethal injection, except there's not the ability to pass that. So the effect is that Nebraska has also abolished the death penalty. But it is significant, I think, in the United States that a state like Montana abolishes the death penalty. We are seen as one of those anomalous red states that's turning blue, if you will. And so as a consequence, it's more important and more significant if a state that voted repeatedly Republican moves in that direction. We've seen that same excitement as we've elected a Democratic governor, as we've passed the smoking ban and things along those lines. People look to Montana, and it's more of a bellwether, if you will. If Montana moves in that direction, then they say that's more of a consensus. It's important for two reasons. It's important so that other states, like Montana, can follow that lead. And it's also important because it sends a message to the courts saying that this is the census of the people moving in the direction of abolition. So I'd ask you, learn about this issue, find and follow what's being said and written about this issue. Speak to people who are going to go to Helena. Find out whether or not they will support the abolition. And if they won't, don't vote for them. And if they will, support them. So those are some of the primary issues. I think that you have to understand that even if we prevail in the upcoming challenge, that there is more work to be done. I do expect that we will prevail in the litigation, but this will only ban one type of execution protocol, but leave the death penalty still as an option to the courts, and provided that the state can develop other forms of execution which the state is willing to proceed with. And I want to come back to that as well, because I think it's important for everybody to understand that if we just have the death penalty as an option, even though the protocol is not lawful, that still is going to expend money in the state of Montana, large amounts of money, as we've already seen. But I want to step back, if you will, and tell you something about why I support the complete abolition of the death penalty. Because I think that that's where you have to build the basis and the foundation of the argument about legal injection and the like. I have come to believe that the death penalty is cruel and unusual punishment, that it's a violation of the 8th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Presently, the death penalty is disproportionately applied to minority members of our society. It's applied in a random and very capricious manner and has virtually no predictability. The exercise of the death penalty is riddled with mistakes, both in the sentencing and potential executions of individuals who are innocent or individuals who should not be subjected to this severe a sentence. The highlighted aspects about Jimmy Ray Bromgard: he is a client of mine. Mr. Bromgard spent 15.5 years in prison for a crime that he didn't commit, and it could have just as easily been a death sentence as opposed to a rape that he was convicted of, because of the way in which the attitude of law enforcement was at the time that they started out. I think most of you appreciate that more than 200 individuals have been freed due to the use of DNA evidence. Those individuals have been found to have been convicted of crimes that they were not convicted of. It's important to know that Mr. Bromgard is not the only individual who has been freed of crimes that were committed or they were convicted of because of DNA evidence. There are at least 2 other individuals who were freed as well, and this goes back to the operation of the crime lab, and something which the state of Montana has never completely audited. And so as a consequence of the over 200 individuals who the crime lab came forward with evidence about during a period of time when Mr. Arnold Melnikoff, who was the director of the crime lab, was involved, we have looked at only three of those cases in depth. In all 3 of those cases, what we found was innocent individuals were convicted of crimes that they didn't commit. We are not and have not yet looked at the rest of those. There are 217 cases that we have never looked at closely to determine if there is another mistake. Now ask yourself, if you were going to Las Vegas, and the odds were that you'd already seen 3 out of 3 examinations say that there was a wrongful conviction, don't you think you'd want to look at the other 100 or 217 cases to see if maybe the same percentage applied, or maybe half, or maybe 10% of it? If it's only a 10% error, that means only 21 other individuals have been wrongfully convicted of crimes that they didn't commit. I'll just tell you a little bit about what Jimmy Ray Bromgard's life was like, because I've worked in the prison a good deal. He came into prison with what's called a jacket, that's what the sentence is, of a sexual predator because he was convicted of raping a 8-year-old child. His day started on the high side when his jail cell would open. In months at a time, the first thing that happened to him was that one or more other individuals came into his cell and beat him up. His jaw was broken. His nose was broken. He ultimately figured out that the way to protect himself was to act out so that he would be stuck in max. 23 hours out of a day, shut down in a room, and the reason for that was that then he didn't have to confront the terror of what happens when your jail cell opens and other people come in. During that same period of time, other individuals on the high side were killed because of some of those discretions. Our correctional officers, unfortunately, are not particularly sensitive to caring for or about individuals who are preyed on by others. During that same period of time when Mr. Bromgard was in prison, we had the prison riot in 1991. 6 PCs were killed. Jimmy could have been one of those individuals. He had left Max and had just gone back to the high side about a week before the riot occurred. And it is happening all over the place as to what is going on. And the folks on that video told a little bit about the issues of how the police attitude worked toward finding somebody who's guilty of a crime, and they will overlook, once they focus on a person, they will overlook everything else that's out there. My co-counsel, Peter Newberg, and I were talking not too long ago. The two most recent exonerees of DNA evidence are 2 individuals who were just released from capital punishment crimes in Mississippi. Both of them had been convicted of crimes, and the testimony was that they had tooth marks on the victims and the individuals. There were experts from the state who testified that their teeth mark matched the teeth marks on the victim, and that as a consequence, that's how they were convicted. When the evidence turned out that the DNA didn't match, and when the probe went on, what they discovered was that there were no teeth marks. That the testimony of the 2 individuals who said under oath in court that they did that, the evidence was that they made the testimony up. Those things don't just happen in Mississippi and Alabama. They happen in New York, they happen in other states, and they have, I believe, happened in Montana. Error is prevalent in all states that have the death penalty. We are not perfect in our lives, and too often we are not perfect with respect to how the death penalty is administered. National studies say at least 75% of all death penalties are subject to some flaw, either in the guilty phase or in the sentencing phase. And that's just national. What happens in Montana? If you look, the statistics bear out that we're just like everybody else. 68% of our convictions in one form or another, death penalty convictions, have had flaws in them. On at least 4 occasions, the courts have set aside death sentences, directing either that inmates be resentenced to a lesser sentence or set aside for other areas. 4 individuals who, when I started working at the prison, who were at that time under death sentence, have simply been released from those death sentences because of inappropriateness in either the prosecution or in the sentencing aspect. Now, if we go to why we have the death penalty, a number of years ago at a similar forum, Governor Roscoe and I were debating this same issue, and he said the only justification that he could see for the death sentence was deterrence. And he then offered his own view that, in fact, the death penalty did deter crime. But the fact of the matter is that that may have been his personal view, but it's not borne up at all by what criminologists say across the board as to what's going on. There is scant research to support the proposition that the death penalty deters. And there is, in fact, several reasons for that. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that simply because it's so important to meet that argument, if you will. Because it is, I think, for most people, the only real justification for what we're doing in sentencing individuals to death. As I've noted earlier, this whole process, and I think more and more people are coming to believe that this process is inherently flawed and frequently results in erroneous sentences. And as a consequence, if you hold that belief, the deterrent effect of a sentence like that simply is lost. Second, it's just simply too random in application to deter crime. It's too easy for any individual to quickly become that death penalty won't be applied to their act regardless of the severity of the crime. I've worked in the prison system now for close to 18 years. And during that period of time, I've gone repeatedly to the prison during a period of time right after the prison riot. I represented a number of individuals. I worked mostly on the high side and in max. But I got to know individuals and know what brought them to prison. And I could take you across the campus and point out other individuals who had committed the same or similar crimes to those who were under a death sentence. And I could not tell you, I could not explain to you. Well, I could, and I will get to some of those explanations, but I couldn't give you a good, logical, reasoned explanation as to why one person was under a death sentence and one person was under a life sentence or less. It is just simply impossible to explain that. The third reason why I think the death penalty doesn't deter is just simply because even with the actions that Congress took a number of years ago to cut out the successive and repetitive appeals, the fact of the matter is the amount of time that goes between the commission of the crime and carrying out of the death sentence is literally decades long. And so as a consequence, if something happens and decades later there is a death, there is no consequence and there's no tie between that. The individuals who are currently under a death sentence, there are only 2 in Montana right now. One has been on death row for over 20 years. 24 or more years. Duncan McKenzie, who I represented and was executed in 1995, had been under a death sentence for over 24 years at the time of his death. It also, finally, I think the death sentence simply doesn't deter due to the very nature of the underlying capital offenses. There are a number of reasons why people kill. However, none warrant society taking an individual's death. And I think, again, you saw just a little bit about the issues on this video, but criminals simply don't go through, who commit a capital crime, go through any sort of planning or stealth, and it's not a matter of a cost-benefit analysis that's being done where somebody weighs the benefit of the crime and the potential penalties. On one hand, that simply doesn't happen. Rarely, rather most of the time, capital offenses are just simply the result of a combination of factors, none of which are affected by the potential of a death sentence. Individuals who commit capital crimes, virtually all of them are individuals who are I think we'd call them socially disabled or socially deficient individuals. They're incapable of usually incapable of forming close bonds or friendships with others. They're usually incapable of empathy. They're incapable of projecting that their own actions could cause harm or injury to another. Usually that social disconnect happens very, very early in individuals' lives. It's usually thought to be the result of early sexual and childhood violence that's been acted against individuals. About 80% of all inmates have a history of early childhood abuse. The percentage is higher among capital offenders. Recent studies say that come to the conclusion that this social disconnect is almost the most extreme in the capital offender. Typical capital crimes are not planned crimes. You heard a little bit about that again in that video, but they're usually the result of an unexpected escalation of poorly thought out lesser crimes. Typically a robbery or a burglary that's gone awry, with events that cascade basically out of control of an individual. They're frequently the result, and they are most often in Montana, the result of the easy availability of firearms. Capital crimes usually involve drugs and alcohol, not that the perpetrators are necessarily intoxicated or high, only that those individuals have used substances sufficiently so as to wipe away the normal inhibitions that you and I would otherwise have that form a boundary between what we do and whether or not we could kill someone else. We're all taught very, very early not to take another life. We do that in our early upbringing, in our early childhood. It takes a tremendous combination of a number of bad things to happen in sequence for another person to alter those teachings and to be allowed to kill another human being. Even in our military, as you look and you hear and you read about the training, even our military, it takes a tremendous amount to kill an individual, to get soldiers to commit, and it is equally as difficult in our civil society. So as a consequence, if you will, all of that tells me that there is no deterrent effect on a capital offense, that punishment just simply is so foreign to almost anybody that they go forward with respect to that. I would point out two other observations relative to the capital offense. First, I want to talk to you a little bit about the proper expenditure of funds, public funds, and compare exactly what's happening there. Capital sentences in the United States, and specifically in Montana, are very expensive. Most capital cases consume an additional $1 million or more per case. Most of those funds, about $400,000 to $750,000, are now expended up front. It's between the time of arrest and sentencing. This is because at the commencement of a prosecution of a capital offense now requires at least 2 death penalty certified attorneys with numerous experts, including mitigation experts and psychologists, to speak of issues of intent and the effects of early childhood abuse. As I've noted, we have to abolish the death penalty. But even if we don't, if there's never another conviction of a capital case, we still get to spend these upfront costs, even if there's not a sentence. In Montana, the last 3 capital cases have resulted in no death sentence. In one, the court declined to sentence an offender to death, although he was convicted. And in the others, the Supreme Court of Montana found that the prosecution took too long to notify the accused that it was going to be a capital offense, and therefore it couldn't, when the case was not allowed to proceed to the death penalty phase at trial. But even so, the taxpayers in Montana spent over $1 million on those 3 cases alone. That's because they were capital cases, and so as a consequence, so we got to spend the money, even if we didn't get the expected result. And if you think about the process, once a capital offense occurs, once there is a conviction, there's an automatic appeal to the Montana Supreme Court. There's then the trip through the federal system. Every year that an individual is under a capital sentence after conviction, it costs between $100,000 to $150,000 extra money just simply because of the amount that we just keep on grinding our way. You can do the math. It takes a couple of decades at $100,000 to $150,000 a year, and 20 years, you get to spend a lot of money. And then, as I've said, in Montana, what we find at the very end is then those sentences, if they're set aside, we've spent that money for what purpose? I think the thing that has always driven me the most, however, is in looking at, and I've spent a fair amount of time looking at those individuals in Montana who recently have been sentenced to death. And what I find disturbs me the most about the profile, if you will, of those individuals. Almost everyone who's sentenced to death is a stranger in the community where they've been found guilty of that crime. The individuals who have been sentenced to death in Montana have been all poor. Virtually all have been represented by appointed counsel, usually underexperienced, underpaid, and without adequate resources for investigation or expert testimony, including at the penalty phase. Montana now has a new and much more effective public defender system, one that I'm quite proud of having in Montana because I was involved in that litigation. But even though it's been operating for only a few years, as I said before, we've seen some remarkable outcomes. The last 3 death capital cases have resulted in no death sentences. And so as a consequence, that's good. But those 2 individuals who are now under a death sentence in Montana unfortunately got there under the old system. One of those individuals, Ron Smith, had, as an attorney, he spent a total of 10 hours from the time of the initial interview to sentencing. The individuals who have been sentenced to death in Montana typically have been subject to early childhood abuse, often sexual abuse. What we find almost entirely is that a lot of these individuals also have had significant head trauma. There was a recent study that suggested that there was identifiable head trauma in virtually every capital defendant. Usually the individuals who are sentenced to death start out with some sort of a focus of some law enforcement personnel who pushed to make that a capital case. And individuals are frequently members of racial minorities. At one time in Montana, we had 1 Afro-American out of 4 capital defendants under a death sentence, when our Afro-American population is about 1%. At one time, we had 2 out of 8 death sentence individuals who were Native Americans, when our Native American population was 5%. So that's what really drives, I think, the concern that I have, is that these are very, I think, disturbing statistics. They underscore the conclusion that I've reached, that in Montana, in America and in Montana, society executes the poor, the slow, the strangers, and the racial minorities in our communities. From these facts, I simply reach the conclusion that we have to abolish the death penalty in Montana. Now, before we do that, we have to confront, to some degree, the current method of execution in Montana and elsewhere, the lethal injection protocol. The last execution in Montana was by lethal injection, as have been all 3 of the executions since 1995, when we commenced executions following an almost 50-year absence of executions in Montana. It seems almost that it should have been obvious to us that having gone 50 years without an execution in Montana and not seeing any sort of huge rise in capital offenses, that Montana should have realized that we didn't need the death penalty at all. Unfortunately, we didn't. And so starting in 1995 with Duncan McKenzie, we've executed 3 individuals. The last was David Dawson, a volunteer, who basically said, and the state agreed, to assist him in suicide. I led the challenge to that death. And had we been able to find a way to find standing, I think we would have stopped that execution. The Montana Protocol has been challenged like the same protocol that we follow in Montana has been challenged in any of a number of states. Arkansas, California, Delaware, Missouri, Ohio, Tennessee, and the District of Columbia. One of those cases in the United States District Court in California concluded after an extensive hearing that the administration of the lethal injection protocol was barred by the Eighth Amendment because it was both cruel and unusual punishment and likely to result in the infliction of pain and suffering through the administration of the three-drug protocol. This case is now on appeal to the Ninth Circuit. And if that circuit affirms, then what we will see is basically a bar against executions in Montana. Montana's protocol is, I think, open to a number of challenges. The statute in Montana that authorizes lethal injection only sets forth two of the drugs, it only permits the use of two of the three drugs that we use. The Department of Corrections uses the three-drug protocol nevertheless. Judge Malloy, when he heard this case in the summer of 2006, said, "I'm deeply troubled by the death warrant in this case, and looking at this statute, when I read the statute, the protocol goes beyond the statute. And if the protocol exceeds the bounds of law, then you truly do, it seems to me, have a potential homicide." He asked the Attorney General's office why it was that they were on the side that they were on, advocating for the protocol. He said, "Aren't you concerned that this is a violation of the law? Shouldn't you be with the plaintiff?" They declined to move. He also said, and I thought it was very interesting, with all of the evidence, then I think there could be a determination as to whether or not the Montana statute, as written, is unduly vague, or whether or not executions that go beyond the specific authorizations of the statute are in fact legal injections. And then the protocol that is involved with the current execution protocol, whether or not that is in fact, whether it violates the Eighth Amendment. The Constitution prohibits punishment which involves something more than the mere extinguishment of life, such as torture or a lingering death. It prohibits the infliction or unnecessary pain in the execution of a death sentence. There's nothing more cruel or unusual than a purposeless and needless imposition of pain and suffering of another human being. When we execute human beings, we do exactly that. The three-drug protocol was developed from the states of Texas and Oklahoma, and I think it always strikes me as interesting that even though in the United States we see a lot of executions, Texas, Oklahoma, Florida, Carolinas, and Virginia are the three states where the predominance of executions have occurred since the 1970s. Texas was the first to propose this three-drug protocol as a humane way to execute individuals without simply the horror of electrocution and the burning of an individual while still alive, and without having to watch an individual struggle and strangle to death in a gas chamber. So essentially, we borrowed a drug protocol from veterinarians to end pet lives, and then proceeded to use it on human beings. It's never been, quote, tested, if you will, on human beings. It's just been used in executions. The three drugs are basically a barbiturate, which renders the individual unconscious, a paralytic agent, which freezes the individual so that they can't show signs of whether they're conscious or not, and then potassium chloride, which disrupts the heart functions and causes cardiac arrest. As I said, the first two of those drugs are the only drugs that are authorized by Montana statute. the Montana statute does not allow or does not mention the third, potassium chloride, yet it is the latter that is used in all of the executions in Montana. The risk of a mistake during the administration of these three drugs is substantial. Montana heightens those risks by not requiring that individuals who administer the drugs have training needed to effectively measure the administration of the initial barbiturate to assure that the inmate is completely unconscious before the rest of the protocol is administered. Indeed, this problem with the three-drug protocol starts with that initial drug, which, although it's used by anesthesiologists during surgery throughout the United States, is used in the operating room simply to induce a patient to a level of unconsciousness and then to allow the introduction of other drugs to assure that the patient remains unconscious and painless throughout a surgical procedure. Sodium pentothal was never intended by the medical profession to be used in a hospital setting to both induce and sustain unconsciousness. However, when the state becomes the executioner, it uses that drug in what I think is an inappropriate manner. Administration of any drug intravenously requires skill and training. It requires precision and profession. Monitoring an individual's state and level of unconsciousness requires training and experience. The Montana protocol contains none of those safeguards to assure that an individual has achieved a level of unconsciousness, to assure that the inmate is at a state where pain cannot be felt. And there appears at least to be some evidence from at least two of the executions that the inmates who were undergoing the protocol had not necessarily remained unconscious throughout the entire procedure. Aside from what I think are the individual problems in using a barbiturate to achieve a state and length of unconsciousness which it was never designed to obtain, most commentators and critics of lethal injection also use and point to the paralytic agent as one substance which is the most questionable in this entire procedure. The paralytic agent stops all movement of an inmate, but it also stops all voluntary muscle contractions, including lung functions and diaphragms, the movement of the diaphragm. Conscious or not, injection of this drug just simply stops an individual from being able to move. It stops the individual from being able to breathe. And if the individual is not sufficiently unconscious, then the individual undergoes the sensation of being suffocated and struggling for breath. During two of the executions, the struggle has been evidenced by what seems to be the sound of snoring. But that is not what experts say is an individual who is asleep, but that is an individual who's not quite unconscious, struggling for breath. That's what needless pain and suffering is all about, folks. That's what needless pain and suffering is about, that's prohibited by the Constitution. So the this paralytic drug is administered, and it's administered for only one reason. It's to assure that the witnesses to the execution don't have to see an inmate struggling as the other drugs are applied to the inmate's body. We want the individual to appear as though they're just falling asleep. And so we've introduced a drug that paralyzes. It also may suffocate individuals while they're conscious. Of course, once an individual is paralyzed, once the individual is undergoing that, then he can't twitch or shudder or flail. The inmate remains still, regardless of whether or not the inmate is unconscious. And if the inmate isn't unconscious, then the inmate struggles with his breathing, as his breathing stops and as he starts to strangle to death. Beyond this, if the inmate is not unconscious, when the potassium chloride is administered, then the inmate experiences the fierce burning sensation as that drug courses through the veins to the heart. Any problem with the administration of these drugs will inflict pain in an inmate. Since there are three separate drugs the risk of incorrect administration increases exponentially. Add to this the lack of training and qualifications for personnel who perform executions. Add to this the lack of minimum safeguards to assure that the procedure is carried out correctly. And add to this the lack of detailed and accurate record keeping, and you have a procedure that is almost guaranteed to cause unnecessary pain and suffering in an unconstitutional manner. Montana's Constitution, fortunately, invokes a higher standard than the standard imposed by the United States Constitution. Our Constitution guarantees the right of human dignity in all individuals. And we submit that the Montana Constitution prevents punishment which degrades the dignity of an individual. So it is on those grounds that we intend to bring a challenge. But as we proceed to challenge this procedure, this drug protocol, which is contrary to statute, administered by untrained and unskilled individuals in inadequate facilities with no training or experience, some attention must be given to the Kentucky case that's pending before the Supreme Court. That case will not prohibit lethal injections, even if the inmate prevails. It only will set the standard for what is the meaning of cruel and unusual punishment at the federal level. Montana, which has a higher standard, protecting human dignity, will not be affected by that ruling regardless of how that court comes out. I tell you this just simply in summary. Society in Montana should not retain the death penalty, which is used to retaliate against an individual for the life taken of another person. When we seek revenge and when our punishment is mere retaliation, we cheapen all human life. We have to ask the question of why we believe that by killing a person who has killed another person, we will thereby keep people from killing other people. It's obvious that this action never will prevent one person from killing another. It is, I would tell you, time to abolish the death penalty in Montana. Thank you. And I'm more than happy to take questions.
Take questions and discussion.
What do you say to liberal friends who know all this and say, but I still favor the death penalty, at least for some people?
You know, I don't know how to respond to that. Quite frankly, it always seems to me as though I don't find, I guess I'd have to step back. I don't find people who know all this who then say, I still support this. I think that it's a process of education. And the more I've seen of the individuals who as they have become educated, they have moved. I've seen good people move away from the death penalty just simply because they look at the underlying facts. And I think that that's what we have to rely on. Yes?
Mr. Waterman, I found what you had to say both powerful and effective. And I hope that the text of your statement is available and can be reproduced. And I hope, too, that we might find a way for you to make this statement or a similar statement and have it videotaped so we could play it on our public access television station. Well, so we could play it on the radio.
I see that there's a camera back there, and I was wired for sound as I stepped into this room. So as a consequence, I expect that there is going to be some ability to do that. I have shared with Jennifer the text of this. I made some minor revisions, and I've elaborated on it just a little bit more. But I think that I'd need to talk with Jennifer, but then I'd be more than happy to provide the text of that.
Great.
If you should have cards Did you get a card? If you want to email me, I can shoot that over to you.
Nancy?
I'm just wondering, when the U.S. is one of the few countries in the developed world that still has a death penalty, and so many other countries have done away with this years ago, why has the U.S. been so slow to come to this more, what I would call enlightened position?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I was thinking the other day about, you know, it's the company that we keep. The six countries that lead the world in the use of the death penalty are China, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, Sudan, and the United States. That's the company we keep. I don't think that that's necessarily the company that we should be keeping on this. I don't know that I don't know what the answer is. I mean, I think it historically goes back to any of a number of issues. You know, there was a period of time in Great Britain when they had any of a number of public executions and things like that. And they finally said, it's not working, it doesn't make sense, and they stopped. And ultimately, I think it's going to be a combination of courts and legislatures that say one way or another, we've had enough, it doesn't make sense, we're not going to do it anymore. The courts in Nebraska have just done that, and I would urge that I think that the courts in Montana ultimately may well do that with respect to lethal injection. The legislature in New Jersey did that, and I would challenge our legislature to join the legislature in New Jersey and put a bill on the governor's desk that abolishes the death penalty at the end of the next session. Yes?
The legislature having that kind of mandate is certainly important, but I would hope that they go beyond simply the protocol and the fact that innocent individuals might be executed, and base it on what we would hope would be the rule of law, the establishment of what are we here for? We're here to build a civil society, and you can't out-trump violence.
I agree with that, and I think that ultimately has to be the message, that this is an ineffectual way, and it is. It just simply goes back to using retaliation and retribution. And if we look at the societies that use those two as a basis for their civil process, we see a process which is often broken that results in tremendous harm to other individuals. Yes?
Jen, there's a question for you.
Oh, sorry.
About sort of internal politics in the coalition. I think, well, with your question, it exposes the fact that there are people with all sorts of moral reasons for perhaps wishing to abolish the death penalty. When we start expressing some of those, then it gets problematic. I mean, for instance, I found when you were saying, oh, and this is why we're against the death penalty, I was practically booing and hissing at you, Jim, because I think that by my moral basis, that's repellent logic that you were using. Because it seemed to imply, oh, it's okay if we execute the guilty, but we have to be leery about executing the innocent. And you were saying some of that too, Ron. And I mean, I have different reasons for why I'm getting, and some of my thinking is, it's about community, it's about what we were all doing. I think I understand homicide. I think individual homicide is, I can think I could justify it in lots of circumstances, but not state-sponsored homicide. But that's just me. Anyway, so I'm wondering, how does the coalition hang together? If there are people that probably, I suspect, have come from all sorts of directions, and when you start talking about it, it actually divides the coalition.
Actually, the coalition has worked together for years, and I think the reason is, no matter how we get there, we all have the same goal. I mean, the goal in the end is to abolish the death penalty. And some legislators and some people and some members of the coalition are persuaded by the fact that human beings are fallible and we can make mistakes. And so we shouldn't have that power of life and death when we can make mistakes. And it's been proven we can make mistakes because we have innocent people. And some of that is where people come from. And some of them, like my father, for instance, when I took this job, he's like, "What in the heck are you doing?" And he's like, he did. And he's like, "I don't know why you're doing that." And eventually he was persuaded when I brought him numbers and I said, "Look at what we spend." And that's what persuaded him. I wasn't going to get him through the belief that killing people who kill people to teach that killing people is wrong doesn't work. But I showed him the numbers, and thanks to Ron for bringing those out about the numbers that we look at, and that's what convinced him. And so everybody came to it as for a different reason. I mean, we have murder victims' families in the coalition that they came from a completely different reason, and that's through forgiveness, or because they don't believe that the tribute to the memory of their loved one should be another death or should be more violence. And so everybody in the coalition, I think, came to the coalition for a different reason, but we're all there for the same goal. And that's really how the coalition stays together. And I hope that answers your question. But I try to bring up a number of different reasons because the end goal is to abolish the death penalty, and how you get there, how I can help you get there is my job, and that's what I do, and that's what I want to do. I mean, as I said, I cannot get why my dad does not understand that basic human rights, we should not kill people. State-sponsored killing is wrong. But that's not how to get him to wear his belief.
Yes?
I know.
She's over there. I think this might be a question for Mr. Waterman, but I've always been curious as to how it eventuated that once having gotten rid of the death penalty, you reinstated it.
Well, we didn't get rid of it. We just simply didn't carry it out. Well, there's a number of explanations. Before Duncan McKenzie in '95, the last execution actually was an execution here in Missoula County in the 1940s. And for the longest period of time, for whatever reason, for probably a variety of reasons, there then was not another execution. Part of that was because there was a period of time when the Supreme Court struck the death penalty as being unconstitutional, and then it was reinstated. And we came back, and why we did that in the mid-'70s, I'm not sure that I understand yet all of the politic that was behind it. I would submit, because I was part of that group at that time. I stood silent when people proposed to reintroduce the death penalty instead of saying at the time we don't need it. And so as a consequence, and I think sometimes, unfortunately, the silence of well-intentioned, good people will allow the voices that are shrill but extreme to carry the day. And I think that's what happened in the 70s. We had an opportunity to just simply say we don't need it anymore. We're beyond that and the like, but not enough good people, well-intentioned people stood up and said no. And those who had a shrill voice saying we have to prevailed. And I, later in my life, concluded that I couldn't just simply in good conscience say I don't support the death penalty or I can't support the death penalty, but it seemed to me as though I had to stand up and say I don't support the death penalty. And I want you to know why. That's why I've testified before virtually every legislative session since '95. Yes?
In practical terms and in your experience in almost getting it through both houses this last time around, which of the many arguments against the death penalty seem to bear the most traction in the discussion and the political
Yeah.
back and forth.
You know, I think because there are so many arguments, it's hard to say. As Jennifer said, there are some social conservatives who look at that and they say the financial is the issue. There's others who say, I mean, there's a whole hodgepodge of reasons and rationales that people, and I'm like her. I don't care how we get there. What I want is a majority in both houses to pass that bill and the governor sign it. That's the most important thing that I think that we have. And I think that it's important that we continue to have that broad spread of arguments. Because in the past, I've picked up some conservatives purely on fiscal grounds. I think the truth of the matter is, however, and it goes back to a question that was asked earlier, as people look and hear of all of the facts, they recognize for any of a number of reasons why this is wrong. And I don't want to demean those individuals who are social conservatives but nonetheless have voted to abolish the death penalty, because many of them are there not because of fiscal reasons, but because they realize that that's not right and they don't want it done and they don't want another person killed in their name. Yes?
That's going to have to be our last one.
There.
I feel a need to say something. I worked very hard during the last session on this issue, and for the past 3 years I've done a lot of research. All of the arguments that have been stated here are the ones that will change people's minds, and it doesn't have to happen during the legislature. It needs to happen when you leave the room and the people you talk to.
I agree.
We changed a lot of people's minds. We thought we had 23 votes the day of that bill came to the floor. We got 28, and then we lost one. But I need to tell you something. The interesting paradox here is not just passing the bill, but having a governor that will sign it. And if you look at the positions of the two people that are running in the state, you'll be surprised who would sign the bill and who wouldn't. And I'll let that speak for itself without going any further, but there is a lot of work that's going to have to be done to get those votes, because those of you that wonder why we don't have an abolition, it comes down to one vote at one time. And we've got to have the votes when the votes are taken. Otherwise, it's just an exercise in futility, and people will ask 20 years from now, 50 years from now, why would they have this? It was just one vote.
And I would reemphasize that. I think it's important for everybody to go back and start working on those individuals who are going to run for the legislature, who are expressing an interest. Ask them now. Ask them often. Ask them early and often, if you will. Get commitments. Make sure that they understand the arguments. Supply them with information so that they become educated. I think the better educated they are, the more then I think you get these turns to the positive, to confirming the abolition. Thank you very much.